Hello, my name is David Plylar, and I'm a senior music specialist and concert producer for concerts from the Library of Congress. It is my great pleasure to be here with Steven Osborne, who will be part of our virtual series this spring. And we wish we could have him in person, but as everybody is aware, we are in circumstances that don't allow that right now. So we are so pleased that he was willing to give us a virtual alternative as well as to speak with me today to talk about his program. So welcome, Stephen.
Hi, nice to be here.
You know, I'm sure that a lot of our audience knows a lot about you already if they're following what's happening in the piano world. But one thing I wanted to just mention briefly is just what a wide-ranging discography you have through Hyperion. I think you're bordering on 30 recordings for them now, or maybe even past that. And the repertoire that you cover is quite astonishing. It's Debussy, Rachmaninoff, Ravel, Messiaen, quite a bit of Messiaen. I think I mentioned Mettner, Alcan, Britten, and many others. So you kind of have this huge gamut of pieces, and I'm wondering, is this something that you've just always dreamt of, putting down these recordings of such a wide variety of works, or how did this come to be?
Honestly, there's never been any plan at all. It's always, I never even had a plan to record things. Just I was lucky that I happened to be engaged to play the Mackenzie Piano Concerto at the Edinburgh Festival. And there's a guy at Hyperion Records who had this series of unusual romantic piano concertos. And so he got in touch to ask if I would record it. And that was how it all started. And then I came across this sort of jazz composer Kapustin, and I rang Hyperion up and said, hey, this is good stuff. Do you want to make a record of this? And I played him 2 bars down the phone, and he said, yes. And then ever since then, it's just been, I don't know, a question of what I'm obsessed with in any particular moment. And I sort of have this feeling, I've got to do that. And, over the years, Hyperion is, we've come to sort of really trust each other in our judgments. And this guy, Mike Spring, who used to work with Hyperion, he's not there anymore. But he was a real pianophile and sort of really knew the repertoire and actually knew performers extremely well as well, like who would work well in what repertoire. And so he had a very canny sort of attitude towards how the repertoire should be apportioned, because Hyperion's got a lot of good pianists.
Sure. Yes.
And then, and as the years have gone by, it's just, I don't know. I think that trust has increased. And when I have this sense of, I've got to do something, that I really, really want to do something, and Hyperion, like the guy who runs the company, Simon Perry now, we get on very well, and he's very happy to trust when I think, yeah, this is something that's important, from my own point of view to do.
Well, you cover kind of the gamut of kind of essential works. Like you have a Beethoven series now, as well as of course the major works of Rachmaninoff and Debussy, and I think the complete works of Ravel. And so you've hit a lot of these kind of literature milestones in the piano literature, but you also have this knack for finding and bringing to light these more obscure things that do not deserve the obscurity that they have. And so that's something I've always personally appreciated. And does that come from do you find yourself just reading a lot of literature, sight reading? And
I'm afraid I'm actually quite incurious, basically, because whatever I'm obsessed with at the time just really occupies my attention. And I'm not somebody that goes out looking for repertoire, but sometimes it's that people have said, oh, hey, do you want to look at this? This is interesting. Or it might be simply in a master class. Somebody plays something to me and I think, ooh, fancy that. The last time that happened was someone played Lille Joyeuse, which I hadn't thought about since I was at music college. I suddenly thought, oh my God, I really, really want to play that. And that was the start of the last Debussy CD that I did. So, just as I get older, as you develop as a person, your tastes sort of change little by little. And that's sort of how the CDs have tended to develop. One time whoever I am as a person makes me attracted to this stuff. And then as I get older, it sort of shifts a bit, which is nice because otherwise, you know, you go through the stuff you're attracted to, and then, well, what do I do now? So
Right, right.
I feel like there's some kind of journey.
Well, I mean, maybe let's take a look at the particular program that you put together for us, which is, I think, really exciting. But it draws on material that you really do have to dig into these composers to find this music and to really
Mm.
come to know it, because it's not, at least it wasn't to me, just the obvious go-to material. And so this is a program that consists of Debussy and Rachmaninoff, and maybe we could first talk about the Debussy selections. I know that. I believe that the program is going to start with the Image Oubliée, which is a set of pieces, I think dating from the 1890s, so fairly early-ish set. But I have to throw in my obligatory pun before I forget. So I just did, but sorry. But these pieces should not have been forgotten, and they kind of they remind me in a way of that sort of cottage industry of the Liszt valse oubliées and the other romance oubliée and these other pieces that, and although in this case I think it's more that they were just suppressed by Debussy. I'm not sure what the story is, but
I don't know the whole story because it seems to me that they're really quite beautiful and creative pieces. So I'm not sure that it was that he didn't want them published, but maybe there was some reason they weren't, or maybe it was that by the time he would have been able to publish them, they were that middle movement he'd used in Pour le Piano, basically. Yeah. So I don't know if it was that kind of thing. But yeah, indeed, they're wonderful pieces.
And they were, I mean, I know that he, at least my understanding is that he had some reservations about using earlier works as he became a more mature composer, but that's what the Suite Bergamesque was. My understanding is that it was developed early in the like around 1890 or so, before it was revised and published as a later in 1905 or so. So these are it's kind of a collection of early pieces that are given the sort of new light. And so and you played so much Debussy, but you hadn't recorded, at least prior to I don't know if these are coming out on an upcoming CD, but
I'm going to be recording them maybe in the summer.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, great. What is your feeling? I mean, you have this. Is there much Debussy that you haven't touched? I think maybe the etudes you haven't recorded, but
I've not done them. I'm actually going to record everything else. There's two CDs, two extremely full CDs. I think I can just about squeeze everything in. So the first one will be a lot of this earlier stuff, and probably a few later pieces, just so we can make everything fit. And then the last one will be Pour le Piano and the etudes and a few more.
Oh, fantastic!
Pieces. Instinctively, I was more attracted to this sort of more middle to late period Debussy stuff, with the real sonority, when he plays with the sonority so much and the sensitivity of the sound and the layering. But looking at this early stuff, it's still so creative. Like there's hardly a single piece of his that doesn't take some unexpected turn at some point. Sometimes quite radically unexpected, and you're suddenly in this world of feeling that you could not have predicted from the beginning. So that's always really, I was going to say stimulating, but it's more than stimulating. It's like it's very affecting somehow, this spontaneity, which was there pretty much from the start.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I felt like he was able to kind of accomplish at the piano and with the orchestra this similar sense of kind of amazing orchestrational choices. Even with those early piano pieces, I mean, orchestrational in terms of how he deals with the registers and the types of textures and things. Even when some of those pieces are less, focused on the kind of the sonic qualities that maybe you might think of with the preludes or other things, they still come through somehow. It's pretty amazing.
It was very right as beautifully for the piano. Oh, not just beautifully, but imaginatively. And this layering that he's able to do is just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. You also, in addition, you have a recording. I don't think it's out yet, but you have a recording with Paul Lewis coming
Yeah,
up with that
it's
includes some.
really exciting. We just had such a fabulous time touring. There's a lot of the famous French duet repertoire, Mother Goose, Petite
Yeah,
Suite, Epigraphe Antique, all that stuff. It was just a dream. I mean, in simplest terms, both of us find it was just such a relief to play concerts where there weren't many notes.
sure,
So used to all this stuff that's so stressful and like all this,
sure,
so to play something that's basically simple, you're sort of sharing the load, and the overall load isn't very complicated anyway. I mean, most of Mother Goose Suite you can play just with two hands.
sure.
But also we're really good friends. There's absolutely zero drama working together. It's just fun, relaxed, positive, creative.
That's wonderful.
And
You
then
have a
the recording happened sort of just at the time that things were starting to close down last year, at the beginning of last year when the pandemic was starting to grow and borders were closing and all that. So we felt really lucky to be able to finish the project off, because otherwise, God knows when it would have all been
right,
sorted.
right. Well, I look forward to that. I mean, I really enjoy your Schubert collaboration with
Oh
him
yeah,
as
that was
well.
fun too.
Yeah, yeah. So back to the program that you put together for the library. You have so these two Debussy works, including one of his most famous works, the Clair de Lune, and then we move on to Rachmaninoff, and you've chosen a number of works that I have a feeling many people have not heard. Some of the pieces are actually represented in the music division's collections, including some holographic manuscripts of the Oriental Sketch and fragments and the posthumous piano piece or prelude in D minor. And among other things, we have a lot of the stuff that Rachmaninoff wrote after 1916. so
Yeah.
A lot of them tend to be the Corelli variations or the some revisions of some of the Opus 3 pieces, the Moments Musicaux, and some other pieces that he redid in the 1940s, as well as some of the later works like the Paganini Rhapsody and other things. And I think that you've been to the library to do some research, and in fact,
that was one of the most thrilling days of my life. To see it. I was particularly curious about the Fourth Piano Concerto, and looking at the sketches and looking at the tune that he started with, and then there's how he sort of cut a few notes out, and then suddenly the tune becomes much more vivid. Like, and it's such a mystery in a way where melodies come from, and seeing that process of having some germ of an idea, but it's not quite crystallized, and then that process of paring it down to its essentials so it really speaks. Just wonderful. Just simply, there's something so thrilling about seeing the handwriting and imagining you're touching the same sheet that he touched. And
right.
It really is fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the earlier materials that we have they're fading. They're done in very light pencil. So like the song cycle that has the famous the Margaritki, the daisies. So we have that transcription as well, but we actually have the original song. It's just as tiny, very light pencil, and there's just something very moving about just seeing that. And that's one of the great pleasures of seeing these things, and also realizing that there's a lot to discover. there's a lot that you can learn from those things, and it's not that it's necessarily the manuscript is not necessarily the final word, because we're also very interested in those second thoughts and revisions and things like that come into play. But there's something very moving about that experience. I'm sure that
I think one of the really important things about it is it opens up a window into the normalness of the composers and their indecision and their second thoughts. And it's funny because in sort of in the classical music world, there's this tendency towards being very dogmatic about the composer wrote this, you must play exactly like this, and there's surprisingly little interest in how composers play themselves, which is, I would suggest, 100% of the time not exactly how they wrote it, and sometimes it's radical from how they wrote it. And I don't know, it's a weird impulse to want to tie these things down when in the end it's all about feeling and about expression and you know how the composer does things is almost certainly not going to be exactly your instinct. So I don't
Right.
know. Seeing
And
these changes of mind is lovely because it says, well, oh, of course they struggled themselves, like sort of trying to work it out, and it gives you permission in a way to be a bit more open-minded. I think.
I think it also gives you you start to realize that it could have been, you know, a flat there, a sharp there, or
Yeah.
whatever, and it would have been just as good, and you would have been the
There's,
wiser for it.
there's quite a
That,
nice story about Michael Tippett. I did a CD of, there's two CDs of all his piano works. A composer I love. He's a bit of a Marmite composer. You know, some people really don't get on with him, but for me, it's some of the most moving music from the 20th century. It's strongly influenced by Beethoven. Anyway, the story is the Lindsay String Quartet, or one of his biggest promoters, the right word. They played a lot of his music, and they went to him to ask about what some notes were, because it was very complex harmonically what he did. It was very hard to work out, if there might be mistakes in the score. And so they showed him the score, and he basically said, "Oh, I don't know. Just play me both versions, and I'll tell you what one I like."
That's amazing.
Nice.
I really like that story. That's yeah. There's an element of that, like that. The infallibility is just it's a
Yeah.
non-issue for. It wasn't for these composers either. I mean, Rachmaninoff, of course, was maybe to a fault racked with self-doubt,
Yeah.
and that's one of the this actually affects one of the pieces that you're playing in a way that I wish I knew more about, and I'm not sure that there's um, the original manuscript is available anywhere. I know that we've talked about the manuscript that's held in Russia, but I believe that that's a fair copy of the final version of the piece. But my understanding is that originally the piece was a lot larger,
Yeah. So I think it was
and that
45 minutes originally, the first sonata, and it's now
right.
about 55. As far as I can tell, there's no existing manuscript for the original. Yeah, which is a shame, because actually already it feels quite expansive. So
Right.
probably feel like 10 more minutes. I don't know. I suspect quite a few more sequences, but I don't know.
Probably. But but there was my understanding is that it was initiated by criticism of friends and colleagues whose opinions he respected and whatnot, and of course that tended to happen with several of his pieces,
Yeah.
and resulted in these types of changes. And I'm not so certain that it was always necessary. I mean,
I think
maybe he did feel it was necessary, but
the first piano concerto, I think, really benefited from that
hmm,
revision. But the other pieces, like the second sonata, like he really butchered, I think, especially the last movement, sort of completely destroys the form of it. What others are there? I suppose the third piano concerto, there's slightly more modest adjustments, and that doesn't affect the piece so much. But he cuts out beautiful stuff.
right,
It's a shame. Yeah, but the bigger point about just what it's like to have so much self doubt that if somebody, well, there's this famous story of when he was touring playing the Corelli variations, and when someone coughed, he would leave out a few variations because he thought people were getting bored.
oh,
It's really at an extreme of that kind of sensitivity. But I mean, in a way, it's no accident. The kind of music that he writes is so sensitive and so full of feeling. He's the kind of man that feels things very, very deeply. So yeah, he's going to be the kind of person that struggles with that kind of even suggestion of criticism or sort of implication of criticism that you might uh, think is happening.
right. Just to kind of go back to a point you were making a little bit earlier, with respect to composer as advocate, as a performer, you can't really do much better than Rachmaninoff,
Mm.
as a pianist, composer, being able to advocate for themselves. And of course, a lot of composers don't have that, and if Rachmaninoff wouldn't be able to, achieve the same thing with a, string instrument or whatever. But it's it is interesting to see how they interpret and how that is different from the way a lot of people play
Mm.
Rachmaninoff in his own music. And I wonder, just as a quick aside, does the influence of that of his, because we do have these records of him playing, do those impact the way that you look at the music in a different way in terms of your own interpretation? Or do you sort of take a tabula rasa
Um,
approach to it?
I don't know how much direct influence there is. I mean, it's certainly, when I was at college and I listened to those recordings, it was certainly interesting how very different they were, like how pure musically, how little showiness. I mean, it's incredibly virtuosic, but you can tell he's not trying to show off. It's just simply that's what the music is.
Right.
Um, and it's sort of almost emotionally chaste, one could say. It's sort of restrained, and that as if there's clearly a lot of emotion in the music, but he's not directly showing a lot of it. It's sort of there under the surface. But on the other hand, he said that Horowitz was the greatest interpreter of his music, and Horowitz was much more open. And whether that was humility or he genuinely thought that actually Horowitz was able to bring something out of the music that he wasn't, we don't know. For myself, I mean, I think in a way I'm just temperamentally, I'm a bit more towards Rachmaninoff's way of playing, a sort of not wanting to show off, not wanting to draw attention to myself, but wanting the music to speak as directly as I can make it. So I'm not sure it's so much the question of influence as just I sort of feel a commonality, if that's the word, sort of some kind of shared sense of values or of approach.
Right, right. Well, in addition to the large first piano sonata, which is still, it's 30-35 minutes or so in length, which, and we don't get to hear it that often, so I'm really pleased that this is being included.
It's amazing to learn
But
it. It's very hard to learn, but I'm so glad that I did.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it sounds, yeah, it sounds like a monster, but the we're looking forward to that. But then you also have some of these shorter um, pieces that you can definitely tell are Rachmaninoff, but they're quite different. So the fragments, that one, what did I write down was, I think that one was one that made me think of sort of a almost like a Schumann-esque or a Mettner-Skotsky
Mm.
legend tone sort of opening, like, and then
Yeah.
just something that's then turns into very much recognize Rachmaninoff in it, but attractive and short, but attractive. The Oriental sketch being kind of a more motu perpetuo type of piece. But what is it that kind of attracted you to these more
Well,
obscure pieces and put them with this program?
I had a plan to record all of the solo music, and there would have been, I think, two more CDs after this one that I've just recorded with these pieces that are in the recital. But the process of learning the pieces, as I get older, it doesn't go in as quickly as it used to, and I just thought, you know what, I think I've done enough. So the reason for doing those little pieces was, in order to help complete that project. But they've been lovely to do. And there's, in some ways, they're rather unusual. Like the slightness of those little pieces, they're not quite typical Rachmaninoff. Like you say, like the fragments, it sort of starts in this very sort of gentle and sort of improvisatory way, and small textures, not this kind of thicker stuff that Rachmaninoff often does. There's a bit in the middle of that piece that, to me, I always think of James Bond. It just sounds just like those kind of harmonic shifts you get in the big orchestral pieces. What else? The prelude, posthumous prelude, it's weird, like weird harmonically. There's bits of it which clearly have this Rachmaninoff-ian kind of texture and thickness, and other bits that are just, you're not quite sure what's actually happening in it. The Oriental sketch, that's quite fun. The thing of those, the one that I really enjoyed most was this transcription of the Nunc Dimittis from the All Night Vigil. And somehow, initially, when I thought to play it, it seemed like a really weird thing to take a choral piece, which is slow and there's very little happening, to put it on piano. And I just wasn't really sure it would work. But actually, it's so involving to play. It's so simple, but geniusly written. These little harmonic shifts. I don't know. It's really a glorious piece.
It was also one of Rachmaninoff's personal favorites. So so that was, it's, I don't know, there's something about when a composer tells you that this is the piece that I'd like. I think he even wanted that performed at his funeral. If I'm correct, I'm not sure about that, but in any case, it was very dear to him. That and the I think the bells as well. So some of these pieces that are, well, the Vespers is of course well known, and people do perform that still, but the bells not as much as. But it's always, it's just it is a beautiful piece, and I look forward to hearing the transcription. I have not heard it, so I just know the choral version, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Well, this program is really kind of an exciting one because it has this combination of you can kind of majestic and involved works that not many people know, and so it's going to be exciting for them to be recognizing the Rachmaninoff that they do know within the kind of a new context and a new a set of works that may be new to them. So we're really looking forward to that. I was wondering if you had anything else to say about this particular program, or maybe you could say a few words about any upcoming projects that or other type of repertoire that you've got on the horizon.
Let's see about this program. I don't know. I think we've covered it pretty well.
Sure.
What's coming up is, honestly, it's very hard to know what's coming up because so much is up in the air at the moment.
Sure.
I mean, the great thing playing piano, you've always got a new piece you can work on. Like, there's this endless repertoire. So, I mean, among things I'm working on, there's this Messiaen des Canyons aux Étoiles. So quite a long, I think it's his longest orchestra piece, about 90 minutes, with a big piano part. Endless Bird Song.
So, when you were at the library, did you see Taranga Lila?
No, I didn't.
We have that manuscript because that was a Kusevitsky commission.
Like this big.
It's gigantic. Yeah, it's amazing. Next time you're there, you'll have to see it for sure. But but that's a great piece. That's exciting.
Yeah. So beyond that, I don't know. So there's a Debussy. I'm working through this Debussy stuff. The etudes I'm starting to learn as well. So at the moment, like the combination of the pandemic and Brexit is proving very troublesome for British musicians. So I've got a plan to go to Spain, but the visa process it's a new process. Right. And because no one was allowed in, foreigners weren't allowed into Spain. In fact, still aren't at the moment. So for weeks after the beginning of the year, they hadn't even set up the process because there was no point. But once it got set up, everyone was sort of casting around trying to work out what on earth to do. And everyone told different things. And so it seems like finally we've worked that out. But the headache to do that.
I can't imagine.
Really, really angry at the UK government. It's just a massive act of vandalism against the sector. So they gave up our right to work visa-free in Europe, but they're letting Europeans work in the UK visa-free. So it wasn't even for a purpose. So it just,
oh, wow. Well, I hope that gets attention and resolution at some point soon.
My guess is I think probably it will be ameliorated in the coming months, I hope, but hard to know. They're quite ideologically driven, this government, so you never know if they're just going to say, well, keep the foreigners out, that's what we need.
Right. Well, on that note,
on that happy
note, maybe just to finish off, I just would say that we're so pleased to have you, even in this remote capacity. And we thank you for putting this program together for us and recording it, and also speaking with me today. Really looking forward to it, and we'll hopefully be able to have you in person sometime in the future.
Oh, that would be great. Nice to speak to you.
All right, take care.
You too.